Chapter 7. General Vlasov, the rest of the story. The Cossacks, who had been in the Vlasov army, found themselves in the British zone after the war. This was in Lienz, Austria, in June of 1945. The British called all of the division officers from General Vlasov's army to a conference, and the British gave their word that they would be returning in the evening. But when the officers went to the conference, they were all arrested. This was done so that there was no leadership left in the camp. The next morning, the camp was encircled by trucks and tanks and armed soldiers. Some people were crushed by tanks. People were loaded into trucks by force and taken to the train station for deportation to the Soviet Union. Gleb has friends who found themselves in this British zone of Austria. Both of them were little boys at the time. They saw their families forced onto trucks. These two brothers, Anatoly and Nikolai, snuck off and hid in the bushes. But they witnessed it all. People were cutting their wrists. The British would sew them up and put them back on the trucks, and they would pull out the stitches. There was blood all over. Women were hitting packages against the bridge abutment, then throwing the bundles into the river. Later it was discovered they were killing their babies. We need to say that Anatoly and Nikolai stayed in hiding, then ran away from that camp, and eventually found themselves in another displaced persons camp, and, in time, also made it to America. At that time, people were just moving, running, walking all over. Roads were clogged with little wagons. People were pulling everything they owned. There were so many people of all ages on the roads that nobody paid any attention. This massacre has now been recorded in history as the Betrayal of the Cossacks at Lienz. Years later, we saw a BBC program on television about this. The program was entitled Army of the Damned. They had interviews with some of the British officers who were ordered to carry out this betrayal, this forcible repatriation. Some of them still had nightmares of what they had experienced and seen. One of them saw women hitting packages against the bridge, then throwing those packages into the river and jumping in themselves. It was then he realized they were killing their babies. The order for the British to do this had come from higher up, from the Yalta Agreement, where it was agreed that all prisoners of war, American, British, and Soviet, would be repatriated as soon as possible. If we read the Yalta Agreement, we find an agreement to carry out fast repatriation of all war prisoners in Germany, but we find no sign of using force to carry out those repatriations. The problem was, another part of the Yalta Agreement was that anyone that helped the Nazis were enemies of the people and were punished accordingly. The Soviets expected the British and the Americans, therefore, to forcibly repatriate these people. The British carried it out. The Americans refused to. There were forcible repatriations carried out in many other cities besides Lienz by the British: Wittenfeld, Sirpitz, Viktring, and others. General Vlasov and his officers, when they returned to the Soviet Union, were hung by their lower jaws on meat hooks and left to die. It was a slow, horrible death for some very brave men who only wanted freedom for their country. To them, anything was better than living under communism. They had a saying, "We'll join the devil to get the communists out." Remember when Gleb's dad was asked to serve as an officer in General Vlasov's army? He turned them down because he did not like what he saw and heard about what Hitler was doing. And because he refused to join, he was sent to Germany as slave labor in the steel mills in Bitterfeld. But if he had joined, that decision would have sealed his and his family's fate, along with the other officers and their families who served under General Vlasov.